I'm Spencer King, visiting with Dr. Dominique Allocco, who is the Vice President of Clinical at Boston Scientific. It's great to have you here to talk about the future. Your company has been so prominent in new development of things, and I'm trying to get a little insight into where you're going in the future. What do you think's hot in the next 5 or 10 years?
Well, fantastic. Well, thank you, Dr. King, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here at EPICSEC. And I will say the past 10 years, I think, have been tremendously exciting in interventional cardiology. When I joined Boston Scientific, the whole company was really focused around drug-eluting stents. That has changed dramatically over the past 5 to 10 years. You see successful therapies like TAVR, left atrial appendage closure. You see some things that weren't so successful, like renal nerve denervation, but it's been a tremendously exciting time to be in the field of interventional cardiology.
Well, let me nail you on that a little bit. So before you abandon coronary disease completely, you got are there ideas out there that are not proprietary that we can think about? Do you think we're done? In other words, you've got a wonderful stent. Other people have wonderful stents. Stents seem to kind of be mature and all that. But, we still have questions about in-stent neoatherosclerosis down the road. Do we have, technical problems with what kind of lesions get what kind of treatment? And we got, bioabsorbable technology is still out there. What any of these things in the coronary realm are still alive?
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't think we're done innovating in the coronary space. 10 years ago, people said stents like Cypher and Taxus were fantastic stents and you couldn't do better. And obviously we have done better. So I think there's room for innovation there. I think there are still advances to be made in imaging. You think of physiology and imaging, and you think of the steps forward we've taken with FFR and advances in intracoronary imaging. I think there's still tremendous potential there. Potentially you see, non-invasive FFR and things like that.
Well, imaging, endovascular imaging, the biggest opportunity there, in my view, is that people might actually do it because the utilization is way down. And yet the evidence seems to be strong that this really gives you a lot better results.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think one of the key limitations there is just training people, and if people knew how to interpret IVUS.
I don't know about it. Is the reimbursement keeping up with it or not?
No, I think that's a challenge. There's no differential reimbursement for it, but probably an even bigger one is the one you mentioned, that many interventional cardiologists just aren't familiar with techniques like IVUS, and I think even just getting better education there would help.
Great. Well, what about? I have to ask you about bioabsorbable. Is there a future?
I don't know the answer to that.
I mean, your company said probably very smartly, okay, let the other people got to work on this, but as you know, there are a lot of people outside the U.S. Clearly still. I was in China just recently, and I noticed that there are a bunch of people trying to deal with it. So I guess we won't know for a while whether there's anything there or not.
Yeah, I don't think we'll know. My sense is that will take a fundamental advance in material science, and the existing materials and PLA and technologies like that, to build a stent out of that has the performance characteristics of a modern metallic stent is a really hard problem, and I don't think you can necessarily get there with those materials.
What about in the structural field? It's been shocking to me really how fast TAVR has gone. I wouldn't believe this could work in the first place. Years ago, I used to do aortic valvuloplasty when it first came out, and I found an old publication of ours, actually a book we wrote back in '89, when we had Elaine Cribier coming over and talking about aortic valvuloplasty. We were all doing it, and never imagined that we'd actually put valves in. But so that's going along nicely. The mitral valve seems to be much more difficult thing. You think we'll crack that one?
I do think we'll crack that one. I think people maybe have falsely imagined that treatment of mitral valve disease and transcatheter therapies will follow the same path as TAVR. In one, I think they forget that TAVR was not an overnight success either. And in the beginning, and trying to go transeptally and things like that, it was very challenging. So it wasn't an overnight success. And then I think also what is certainly true is that the mitral valve is more complicated than the aortic valve, and it's probably not going to be a single solution. There's going to need to be multiple different things in the toolkit to treat mitral valve disease. But I'm very optimistic. I think you've seen a lot of advances there, and I think there's a lot more to come in the future.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about it, the mitral valve, a lot of mitral valve malfunction in mitral regurgitation is because the heart muscle is too weak. And with aortic stenosis, the heart muscle is too strong. And so you relieve the obstruction, and you got a real horse behind you. And the mitral, the mitral is all, the ventricle, everything is part of the problem. So that's interesting. One of the things I noticed is we all seem to be putting a square peg in a round hole sometimes, or actually a round peg in an elliptical hole. So a lot of these closure things, to me, when I see them, I say, well, why are we closing those with things that don't fit? What do you think about closure?
I couldn't agree more. I think respecting the natural anatomy is a lesson we probably learn over and over again and don't necessarily learn. But I think, as you point out, very applicable to the mitral valve. One of the technologies we're developing is the Millipede transcatheter mitral repair system. And that is a technology that you can adjust to the shape of the annulus. And I think that is an important thing to consider as we're trying to treat mitral valve disease.
Well, what other technologies you find attractive now for future for?
Oh, I think there's a lot of things, and if I really knew the answer, I think like many things, there's going to be successes and failures. I think we'll see continued evolution in the treatment of valvular heart disease. The existing TAVR devices are very good right now, but I think there's room for improvement. We're just launching the Lotus Edge valve in the United States. That's a technology that I think has a number of nice features. It's fully recapturable and repositionable. You can put it in its deployed configuration, assess the valve with echo, with an aortogram, and if you don't like the position of the valve, you can move the valve.
So one thing that's interested me about all these technologies is sort of the Sears-Roebuck approach to things, where they made the decision somewhere that you didn't want to create systems that only experts, only the most talented people could run. No, you wanted to do it so that all your employees could do it. In regards to the valve, do you think it's helpful that we've got people who put in, here at Emory, hundreds of these valves, and they're very expert at it.
Sure.
But I'm wondering, because we're disseminating all these things, will there be safeguards? Will there be ways that the technology, maybe is a little easier for somebody to do? You talk about repositionable things.
Yeah, absolutely. It's another lesson we probably don't learn, and we maybe repeat the same mistakes, is the importance of ease of use. And I think a technology like this, where if you don't get it right, you can reposition and improve it. I think that's very valuable.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exciting. Well, outside of interventional cardiology, I know Boston Scientific's involved in many areas, in the neuro feedback mechanisms for like renal denervation and other similar things that control things like hypertension are still out there. I don't know where. You got any things to tell us about any other areas of research that you're into?
Yeah, I think one that is tremendously exciting relates to neurostimulation, and particularly one that excites me is the treatment of Parkinson's disease and neuromodulation there. And it's stunning to me. You put an electrode in the brain and stimulate the brain, and you can literally see somebody who's shaking with a significant tremor, and they turn the device on, and the tremor stops. And that's amazing to me. Now, I also think that Parkinson's disease is the optimal treatment has got to be dramatically more complicated than just putting a pacemaker in the brain. So I think that's an area that I'm really optimistic in the future we're going to see dramatic improvement in.
Well, we're clearly not at the beginning of technological innovations in interventional cardiology. We've been doing this for, it seems like a long time, but we realize the whole story is only 40 years old. Unless you say, well, everything we've done built on things for many years before. I don't remember who said it. Somebody said that everything's been invented, has already been invented, whoever that was. Clearly not true, and so it's an exciting time to be a cardiologist, as you are, but also the opportunities to drive what happens in industry to make these things happen. Must be fun.
Absolutely. I think it's, like you say, it's a tremendously exciting time to be working in the field. I think at Boston Scientific, we realize, you have to keep innovating, otherwise you're not going to be around and be a successful company. And we're certainly trying to do that the best we can.
Well, thanks for visiting with us.
Thanks for having me.
You bet.